Now let's wade a little bit deeper into this discussion about partitions and how we use them and what we can do with them. And in this video that I've entitled Partition Schemes and Types, let's talk with a little more detail about what's happening. And I want to clue you in on some things that can be a little bit confusing about partitions. Let's break this into two levels. There are two main ways that you can set up a partition to manage the data, and we'll call those schemes here. So let's talk about these two main partition schemes. The first one is called MBR, and that stands for Master Boot Record. The second type is called GPT, and that stands for Globally Unique Identifier Partition Table, and you will hear that out there in the real world called a GUID table. Some people even call it GUI ID tables. You'll hear that out there as well. Let's concentrate on the Master Boot Record, or the MBR partition scheme first. Stands for Master Boot Record, and this is the oldest type of partitioning. Now, this is where it started on the Windows machines all the way back to the DOS days. This allows 4 partitions to be created on a hard disk, so we can divide our hard disk into 4 sections. Keep in mind here that of these 4 partitions that we can create, we can really have 2 types of partitions. One's a primary partition and one's an extended. Now, here's the difference. A primary partition can hold a bootable operating system, meaning I can install an operating system onto a primary partition and my machine can start up or boot from that primary partition and run that software. Now, an extended partition is still a partition. It's a divided off section of the hard disk, but it's not bootable. So what you usually see out there in the real world is people will create either 4 primaries or they'll use 3 primaries and 1 extended partition. Let's go talk about this other scheme. The Globally Unique Identifier Partition Table, or GPT partition, is kind of the upscaled, new, shiny version of the Master Boot Record. This is an alternative scheme to the Master Boot Record, and notice the big thing right up front. You're no longer limited to just 4 partitions. Theoretically, you can have an unlimited number of partitions on a GPT type scheme. However, Microsoft has limited Windows to only 128, although I've never seen anybody get close to 128. Also, when you're working with GPT, there's virtually no limit to the size of the partition that you can create. But keep in mind, Master Boot Records could not exceed and still can't exceed 2.2 terabytes. That's still a really large partition for an operating system, and not many people run into problems there. Now, the catch with GPT is you cannot create bootable partitions using GPT unless you're using a UEFI motherboard. Now, we talked about UEFI in the 220-801 class, and so you'll have to go study that on the hardware side. And also, let me give you a little disclaimer here, some fine print. This statement that you can't create bootable partitions is not totally true, but it is for the A+ exam. If you're using 64-bit operating systems, Windows 7, even Windows 8, you can do this and you can create bootables, but you won't go that deep on the A+ exam. I just wanted you to know I hadn't gone to sleep on you. There are 5 partition types you need to be familiar with for the A+ exam. Let me warn you here, it's going to get just a little confusing, and I'm going to point it out. The first partition type is dynamic, the second is basic, then primary, and extended. And really, we're at the end of our partition types, but the logical is called a partition. It's really a subdivision of an extended partition. But most people tend to call it a partition, so we'll call this the 5 partition types. A+, CompTIA, lists the logical as a partition type on their objectives, and so we'll agree with them and just continue on. Now, a dynamic partition was introduced by Microsoft with Windows 2000, and this was designed to help get away from some of the limitations of the basic MBR type partition scheme. You can have unlimited partitions, although in Microsoft speak, they call partitions volumes on a dynamic disk. And what's cool about this, you can implement RAID, you can span volumes over multiple drives, you can do all kinds of things that you normally can't do with a disk. Now, a basic disk is a Microsoft term for any disk that's not a dynamic disk. So, if you have an MBR or a GPT disk, guess what? You have a basic disk. By the way, in the Microsoft environment, you can convert a basic to a dynamic disk very easily, but it's a little bit tougher to come back from dynamic to basic. You have to format it as MBR GPT and you lose all your data, so you have to back up and all that. A primary partition is a bootable partition on a master boot record or an MBR drive. You can have up to 4 separate partitions, so you can have 4 primaries on an MBR drive. And then an extended partition is a non-bootable partition on an MBR drive. So as a result, what most people will do is create 3 primaries and then 1 extended, and then they will divide that extended into logical drives. Now, these logical areas have different drive numbers. They're not technically separate partitions, but everybody calls them that, and they're recognized like a partition in the operating system. So that's the partition schemes and types. I hope this has kind of helped you get around some potentially confusing areas. But just remember, a bootable partition is a primary, a non-bootable is an extended.